West.
I move second reading of Bill 26, an act to amend the Employment Standards Act 2000 in respect of leave and accommodation for victims of domestic or sexual violence, and to amend the Occupational Health and Safety Act in respect of information and instruction concerning domestic and sexual violence.
Ms. Sadler has moved second reading of Bill 26, an act to amend the Employment Standards Act 2000 in respect to leave and accommodation for victims of domestic or sexual violence, and to amend the Occupational Health and Safety Act in respect of information and instruction concerning domestic and sexual violence. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for a presentation.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I am very pleased to bring this bill forward once again for second reading debate, and I am hopeful that we will once again see MPPs from all three parties come together, as we did in March, to support this bill, which will enable employees who have experienced domestic violence or sexual violence to get the supports they need to heal and return to productive work. I want to begin my remarks by acknowledging some of the many organizations across the province that have endorsed my bill. These include the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime, the Canadian Network of Women's Shelters and Transition Houses, the Network of Women with Disabilities, YWCA Toronto, End Violence Against Women Renfrew County, Halton Violence Prevention Council, London Coordinating Committee to End Women Abuse, the Peterborough Domestic Violence Network, and I could go on and on. The Ontario Federation of Labour supports my bill, along with the Canadian Labour Congress, CUPE, ETFO, OECTA, OPSU, and Unifor. My bill has been endorsed by public health units like Toronto Public Health, Middlesex London Health Unit, and the Windsor-Essex County Board of Health. Speaker, the economic security that comes with employment is critical to all Ontarians, but it is especially critical when there is a relationship of abuse. If you are a woman living with an abusive partner, going to work might be the only avenue available to you to escape the violence, even if it's only for a few hours a day. When you are at work, you might confide in a co-worker or a supervisor about the violence at home, and that disclosure could connect you to the community services that could help. If you do not work, it is unlikely that you will ever feel that you are able to leave the abusive relationship, especially if there are children involved. The risks of leaving without any kind of financial security are just too great. That's why many abusers try to prevent their partners from working. It is why so many women feel trapped in abusive relationships and unable to leave. Too often, the violence that women experience at home follows them to work. The violence can become lethal, as we know when we remember the tragic and horrific deaths of Teresa Vince and Laurie DuPont, women who were murdered at their workplaces by their abusers, women whose deaths could have been prevented if legislation like Bill 26 was in place. The flexible workplace provisions of Bill 26 would have allowed these women to request changes to their hours of work or to transfer to different locations. The mandatory training provisions of the bill would have ensured that employers and co-workers of these women were trained in how to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence. The violence can also follow people who are experiencing violence to work in the form of harassing phone calls, texts, or emails constantly throughout the day. Abusers may stalk their partners, showing up in the parking lot or at their place of work. Abusers may call employers or co-workers looking for information about their partner's whereabouts. These actions can cause women who are experiencing violence to change jobs frequently, or even to lose their jobs, which is often the end goal of their abusers. We know this from the research, which shows that women with a history of domestic violence have a more disrupted work history than other women. They change jobs more often. They are more likely to be precariously employed in casual or part-time positions. As a result, they are more likely to be low income or to live in poverty. What we also know from the research, Speaker, is that being employed is a key pathway to enable women to leave an abusive relationship. The financial security that comes with employment can allow women to escape a violent relationship and rebuild their lives. That's why Bill 26 is so important. It allows women who have experienced domestic violence or sexual violence to deal with the violence without jeopardizing their employment, to get the supports they need to heal from the trauma and return to work as productive employees. Bill 26 amends the Employment Standards Act to require employers to provide up to 10 days of paid leave, as well as reasonable unpaid leave if necessary, to workers who have experienced domestic violence or sexual violence, or whose children have experienced those forms of violence. The leave can only be taken for specific purposes related to or arising from the violence. These include seeking medical attention, accessing services from a victim services organization, rape crisis centre, sexual assault centre, women's shelter, or similar community agency, getting psychological counselling, meeting with police or lawyers, or finding a new place to live, which is often an urgent challenge for women and their children who are fleeing violence. My bill encompasses both domestic violence and sexual violence because of what I heard during hearings of the Select Committee on Sexual Violence and Harassment. The people who spoke to the committee emphasized the importance of survivor-centric responses to ensure that the needs of survivors are front and centre in government responses to domestic violence or sexual assault. From this perspective, whether the violence was experienced at home, on a date, at work, or anywhere in the community, the basic needs of survivors are the same. They may need medical attention from a nurse or a doctor. They may need to talk to a psychologist or a crisis counsellor. They may need time to meet with lawyers and the police, to go to court and go through the justice system. They may need time to find a new place to live, and they should not have to jeopardize their employment because of the harm that they experienced. We know that a number of U.S. states have already passed legislation to provide unpaid leave for domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. But many survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence cannot afford to take unpaid leave, especially those who are most vulnerable. My bill is modelled after the District of Columbia, which provides paid domestic violence and sexual assault leave, as well as the province of Manitoba, which became the first Canadian province to provide paid leave for domestic violence under the leadership of the former NDP government. Speaker, some may ask about the fairness of asking Ontario employers to pay for the leave. The reality is that employers are already paying for domestic violence and sexual violence in the workplace. There is a cost to employers when their employees who have experienced violence are distracted and unable to perform to their full capacity, when they are often late or absent from work, when they resign and must be replaced. These costs were quantified in major studies by the Federal Department of Justice, which estimate that Canadian employers are already paying $78 million annually due to domestic violence and more than $18 million annually due to sexual violence. There is a significant financial burden on employers associated with domestic violence and sexual violence. Bill 26 shifts these costs to helping employees recover from the violence so they can return to work as productive employees. Bill 26 is also informed by research conducted in 2014 by the Canadian Labour Congress and Western University's Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. This national study, called Can Work Be Safe When Home Isn't?, was based on a survey of more than 8,400 employees, the majority from Ontario. 1/3 of these respondents had experienced at least one incident of violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Not surprisingly, 82% said their job performance suffered as a result of the violence. Nearly 40% said it made them late for work or unable to go to work altogether. And almost 1 in 10, 8.5%, said it got them fired. Less expected as a result from the survey was that the violence not only affected the employee who was being victimized, but also those around them. Close to half of workers experiencing violence said they disclosed to someone at work, and almost 1/3 of those co-workers said their own work performance suffered because of the stress and concern they felt for their colleague. Some may ask whether paid leave is going to cause financial hardship for Ontario employers. However, we know from the experience of Australia, where almost 1/3 of workplaces are covered by paid leave provisions, that employees who access the leave generally request only small periods of time, an average of just 1 to 3 days. I want to touch quickly on two of the other very important provisions of my bill. The first is the requirement for mandatory workplace training on domestic violence and sexual violence. Although the Occupational Health and Safety Act currently requires workplaces to provide information on domestic violence, we know that many employers are not meeting these basic obligations. And because training is voluntary under the Act, very, very few workplaces are investing in domestic violence training for their employees. As I stated earlier, workers who experience domestic violence are very likely to disclose to somebody at work. Mandatory workplace training can help co-workers recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and respond effectively if a co-worker discloses. It will also assist with the implementation of the new reporting requirements under the Sexual Violence and Harassment Action Plan Act. The final comment I would like to make is with regard to the flexible work arrangements under the bill. This fall, the federal Liberal government announced that similar flexible work arrangements are being developed for all federally regulated workplaces. My bill would introduce the same flexibility into Ontario workplaces for workers who have experienced domestic violence or sexual violence. I want to close with an email I received earlier this week, and it read, "Had such accommodations been in place when I was working in Ottawa, I would not have been forced to leave my job, but rather could have been assisted because of an abusive and manipulative ex-husband. I support your bill 100%. Speaker, I ask all MPPs to do the right thing and not only pass this bill today, but let's move it quickly to committee, let's get public input on the bill, and let's see it become law in the province of Ontario. Thank you, Speaker.